Good morning, everybody. We will be getting started in about 2 minutes. We're just waiting on the interpreters. So just give us a second and we'll get started. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. How are you? Happy Monday. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I just have a few quick administrative announcements at the top. So first, thank you everybody for joining today. Welcome to INL's 2021 webinar week on public-private partnerships to counter drug challenges, organized by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Today's session is part of a week-long series of interactive webinars in which we will showcase how government and business can work together to address distinct aspects of the world drug problem through case studies and the sharing of best practices. So before we get started, I just want to thank OAS-CCAD for providing technical support to this week's sessions and for providing simultaneous interpretation into Spanish for these webinars. These sessions are being recorded and will be available online along with a comprehensive list of recommendations that will be posted on our website, which I will drop in the chat box, state.gov/webinarweek2021. For any members of the press, these sessions are off the record. And finally, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of this session. Audience members can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen or by using the raise hand function. Please be sure to use the Q&A button instead of the general chat box to submit questions. And with that, I would like to go over to our first speaker to deliver his opening remarks for today's session. Please welcome the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Jim Walsh.
Well, thank you, Jenna, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third annual meeting on the public-private partnerships to counter drug challenges. This is also our second webinar week. As Jenna said, I'm Jim Walsh. I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for INL. And so allow me to start this morning by acknowledging the support that INL has received from our partners in organizing today's session. I'd really like to thank our panelists from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the International Narcotics Control Board, the Government of Tanzania, and the European Chemical Industry Council. These are just some of the leading voices around the world in addressing precursor chemical challenges, the topic of today's webinar. I'd also like to express my thanks to the OAS International Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission, or CCAD, for providing us with the technical support and simultaneous interpretation for each of this week's webinar session. And of course, thank you to everyone from around the world who's joined us today. Wow, I'm really amazed. Over 600, I'm counting 642 and it's still climbing. That's amazing how many people are attending around the globe. Thank you for all of the attending, especially all those on the other side of the world staying up late to join this webinar. So just so happy to see so many of you and address this really important issue. So addressing the drug crisis, including through enhanced partnerships and innovations, it remains a top priority in the United States. In my country, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated an already dire situation. We now estimate that over 93,000 people died of drug overdoses in 2020. That's a tragic increase of 30% from the year before. And unfortunately, as many of you know, the trend around the globe is not encouraging either. So we all must remain vigilant. And again, I think this is so timely for us to be talking about these topics on this webinar week today. So fentanyl continues to be the primary driver of overdose deaths in the US, but are increasingly seeing deaths that involve fentanyl and combinations with other drugs, including a rising number of stimulants such as methamphetamine and cocaine. And we know that governments cannot address the 21st century drug challenges alone. Our success is predicated on close partnerships with a number of stakeholders, including other governments, international organizations, the research community, civil society, and the private sector. Partnerships with the private sector play a critical role across both our drug supply and demand reduction efforts. And the private sector can take concrete steps to help our communities battle the scourge of substance use disorder, from making it more difficult for criminals to manufacture illicit drugs and traffic them into our communities, to providing employment resources and treatment for people suffering from addiction. That's why we've organized this week's webinar series. And this week's webinar topics will span the gamut of drug control topics, including today's topic, preventing precursor chemical diversions. And it'll be followed by recovery-ready workplaces with introductory remarks from Michael Botticelli, who's the former director of U.S. National Drug Control Policy. On Wednesday, we'll have the quality assurance in treatment, which will feature the acting director of U.S. National Drug Control Policy, Regina LaBelle. And then Thursday, we'll talk about drug sales over the internet with remarks by the U.S. National Security Council's Director for Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation, Carol House. And finally, on Friday, we'll talk about the drug trade and illicit finance, which will include opening comments from Ghada Wali, the Executive Director of UNODC. So very excited to have our panelists, our key presenters. It's going to be a great week. The sessions will also feature experts from U.S. government, international organizations, nonprofit organizations, foreign government partners, and the private sector. Let's talk about today's session. Today, we start the week with one of the most difficult challenges facing the international community in the drug control arena, the diversion of precursors for use in drug manufacturing. Drug trafficking organizations have become increasingly sophisticated in their drug manufacturing capabilities. They are now able to use non-scheduled and designer precursors to produce their deadly products. And earlier this month, we requested that the UN system consider placing 3 precursor chemicals used in the illicit manufacture of fentanyl under international control. These unscheduled precursors emerged following the 2017 control of 2 other fentanyl precursors, NPP and ANPPP, and are specifically sought out by criminals to evade national and international control on those chemicals. So countries around the world have also implemented novel approaches to controlling precursor chemicals, including by controlling chemicals as a class, making it illegal to sell chemicals to a country where that chemical is controlled, even if it is not controlled in the exporting country, and in passing know your customer laws. But the private sector is a key player in many of the potential solutions to this problem. By strengthening suspicious order reporting and information sharing between national authorities and private industry, we can work together to identify illicit activity and intercede before criminals have an opportunity to make and sell these dangerous goods. Today's panel will explore the regulatory challenges in criminals' new approach of using non-scheduled precursors to produce illicit drugs. It will also discuss some of the global tools and programs that can help governments and industry work together to confront this challenge. It will highlight a case study on one country's recent experience in implementing private sector engagement measures, examine how the private sector can help resolve the challenge that many countries face in disposing of seized chemicals, and finally, share some of the key components of a successful partnership between government and industry. So we hope that by the end of this session and by the end of this week, all parties will walk away with some ideas for concrete steps they can take to improve their response to the drug challenges facing our communities. I hope you all leave today feeling inspired to implement private sector engagement strategies in your own domestic or regional context. And I hope you consider joining the remaining session this week. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to seeing and hearing from you throughout the week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jim. Now we'll go over to our moderator for today's session. Allow me to introduce Antonio Mazzatelli from the International Narcotics Control Board. Antonio, over to you.
Here I am. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. Thanks a lot for taking time to open this session and to open this entire week of very, very interesting and absolutely, I would say, fascinating talks. After your introduction, I think there will be very little I could add to what you have already said, other than definitely from the perspective of Vienna and the Secretariat of the International Narcotics Control Board, what we can state is that we are witnessing to the gradual evolution of drug markets towards synthetic drugs. And definitely the world of synthetic drugs unfortunately present new and unconsidered challenges. The framework. Hello? Maybe somebody has a microphone. Yes, now it's okay. The international control system established under the 3 international conventions of 61, 71, and 1988 was more or less designed to face traditional natural drugs. In 1988, the international community understood that in order to produce drug, both illicit drug, both natural and synthetic traffickers and illicit producers needed chemical precursors. So they tried to create a system under which also the movement of chemical precursors would have been under a more flexible control. This system has proved to be extremely effective, or at least has reduced by far the room for maneuvering of international producers. Thanks also to the international cooperation that member states and national institutions have developed all over these latest 30 years. But at the same time, markets have evolved, new drugs have appeared on the international scene, a new methodology for producing drugs have occurred. I was reading just before how Mexican cartel or how the methamphetamine market moved from the use of ephedrine to P2P. As well as we have heard about the boom of opioids. Nowadays, the markets present sometimes the use and the trade of substances, chemical substances that are absolutely illicit, that have no industrial use, and that are used for the production of new synthetic substances. In this respect, the participation, the cooperation with the private sector will become fundamental, as well as the collaboration between law enforcement agencies in finding out the new trends. That would allow to move from what is nowadays mostly reactive system towards a preemptive system, a proactive system that will allow all of us to make the appearance of new synthetic drugs on markets. We will go through this session. This session will last 1.5 hours. We will have experts from the DAA taking the floor and talking about regulatory challenges in addressing the new psychotropic substances and non-scheduled precursors chemicals and the need for voluntary cooperation. Later on, we will listen to the state of art in the area of precursor control by a colleague from the International Narcotic Control Boards. We will then have a very interesting intervention from one of our partners from the national authorities of Tanzania that have developed a particular system of collaboration between the private sector and national authorities. We will then look to the disposal and the cooperation in the disposal of chemical precursor. And finally, we will have the participation of the private sector in finding out which are the challenges and which are also the benefits of this cooperation. So I cut short and I give immediately the floor to our colleagues, Daniel Dobas, Section Chief Chemical Investigation, Division of Control of the Drug Enforcement Agency.
Thank you, Antonio. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to my colleagues. Before we begin our presentation, it's going to be myself and my colleague, John Farmer, from the Chemical Investigation Section. I just want to thank the State Department for sponsoring this very important and timely webinar, as well as all the webinars that will be taking place this week, to bring together experts and leaders from across the United States government, international organizations, nonprofit organizations, foreign government partners, and the private sector. I just want to wish everyone success for the week and thank you all for your attention. Like Antonio said, my name is Daniel Dobas. Excuse me. I'm the chief of the Chemical Investigation Section, excuse me, at DEA headquarters in Washington, D.C. My colleague, John Farmer. John, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. And while we're doing that, if you could bring up the presentation, that would be great. As Dan said, my name is John Farmer. I'm a senior program analyst with the Chemical Investigation Section. It's very great to see so many people tuning in today, and we look forward to giving you our presentation. Dan, back to you.
Thank you, John. So, regulatory challenges in addressing non-scheduled precursor chemicals. Next slide, it's fine. We're going to start with some legal disclaimers that we're forced to put in our presentation. The contents of this presentation do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way. This presentation is intended only to provide clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. Next slide, which I think is another legal disclaimer. The Fair Use Act. I won't torture you by reading this slide to you, but it's there. Next slide. So who we are. We are the Chemical Investigation Section. We're under the Diversion Control Division. We prevent, detect, and investigate the diversion of controlled pharmaceuticals and illicit chemicals from legitimate sources. We also ensure an adequate and uninterrupted supply for legitimate medical, commercial, and scientific needs. Next slide. So we divide our chemicals in the US according to List 1 and List 2. List 1 chemicals have legitimate uses. They're also used to manufacture controlled substances, drugs. They're often labeled as precursor chemicals or precursors, and they become part of the end product. They become part of the drug. DEA registration is required for List 1 chemicals. It's required to keep records, report suspicious orders, and know your customer for importers, exporters, manufacturers, distributors, and certain retailers of List 1 chemicals. Next slide, please. These are our List 1 chemicals. We have 36. I'll allow you a minute to glance at the list before we move on. Next slide, please. List 2 chemicals. They have legitimate uses. They're used in everyday products. They're usually classified as solvents or reagents. There's no DEA registration required, but records must be kept of transactions above a set threshold, and we emphasize the know your customer provision. Next slide, please. And these are our 11 List 2 chemicals. Again, I'll give you a minute to glance at the list. Next slide, please. So we have 4 drugs of abuse right here, and the precursor chemicals that are used to make methamphetamine, cocaine, fentanyl, and heroin. Chemicals both controlled and not controlled. And at this point, I think I will turn it over to my colleague, John Farmer, to present the rest of our slideshow. It seems like a good break to turn it over to my colleague. John?
All right, thank you, Dan. Next slide, please. Thank you. As was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, fentanyl really has had a devastating effect in the United States. So the next few slides are going to be on fentanyl precursor controls. As was in the previous slide, this is just concentrating on fentanyl itself. While we do have 4 of the precursors that are controlled in the US, and at least 2 of them are controlled internationally, what we're seeing, and this is definitely a trend, and this is why it's so important and such a topic today, is the non-controlled precursors that are being used. For illustration here is for piperidone and propionyl chloride. Traffickers are not using chemicals which are controlled. They have moved on to those which are not, because they are much easier to get and they don't have to disguise them, since they're not under international control, or even for a lot of places not under national control. Next slide, please. So here are some of the trends that we've seen. NPP and ANPP were controlled not only by Mexico, but internationally, but Mexico in particular in July 2017. As a result, what we've seen, as I said, is a shift towards those chemicals which are not controlled. For instance, there was a rise in 4-AP shipments beginning in 2019. And Mexico began measures to control 4-AP in mid-2020. It was effective in May 14th, 2021. As was mentioned by Mr. Walsh, the US is proposing to control 4-AP on the international level. The US has controlled 4-AP, I think, starting in 2021 as well. And so, what we've done is we've forced traffickers to then move to another chemical. So what we're starting to see is a shift to 4-piperidone in late 2020. And some of the fentanyl analog precursors, 1-Bach-4-piperidone and parafluoro-4-anilinopiperidine. Next slide, please. This is a good example of what traffickers can do to avoid controls and to make what is a controlled precursor into a non-controlled precursor. Some might have heard a lot of talk about 4-Bach or Bach-4-AP, Bach-piperidone. Well, what does the Bach mean? Well, it's technically referred to as a protective group. And what it does, it's a separate molecule that has been temporarily attached to the precursor. And its only job is to create a distinct substance that subverts controls. It doesn't make the precursor harder to use. It doesn't really change the structure of that precursor. So yields are minimally impacted. And we expect to see more common or other protecting groups such as benzyl, benzoyl, and tosol. So it's very easy for traffickers to take something that is controlled and make it non-controlled. It's kind of the cat and mouse game we played with NPS. They're doing the exact same principle for precursor chemicals. This is why it has become such an important international issue for authorities to try and handle. And there's a lot of talk, and I know there's a lot of experience. There's a lot of suggestions out there for what to do. And this is the point when I want to say that it's crucial for us to get industry involved. We definitely need their help in trying to handle this problem. Next slide, please. I just want to briefly mention some of the projects that DEA is involved with, where we involve industry. The first one is the Industry Liaison project. And the mission of this project is to provide informational outreach to e-commerce platforms and other companies that are involved in the sales of regulated products and schedule listed products over the internet. And one of the things that I think we wanted to make clear to e-commerce platforms was that you are not exempt from the regulations. And a lot of them did not understand that. And so a lot of what we have done is tried to provide outreach and education to these platforms, saying just because you are an electronic platform does not mean that you do not have to comply with US regulations. And so we've had a fairly successful project. You might have seen a press release about our work with Amazon, where they have agreed to stop selling certain products on their platform or allowed those products to be sold. So we've had a very productive engagement with e-commerce platforms. And this work obviously continues. We're still reaching out to different platforms. The second project I'll just briefly mention is the shipping company Liaison Outreach. One of the things that we tried to do is to reach out to the largest shipping companies in the world to let them know about precursor chemicals, their use in drug production, and not only that, but from their perspective, the hazards that some of these chemicals pose to shipping. And so we've had some engagement with the shipping companies and also with industry groups representing the shipping companies. And that likewise has been very productive. I think they've been very receptive to what we've presented. The last project that I'll mention just very briefly is domestic industry education and outreach. This in particular involves our list 2 chemical handlers. We've identified them, and unfortunately with the pandemic and COVID, we haven't been able to really launch this just yet, but what we are intending to do is to reach out to those companies that export large quantities of list 2 chemicals, just to educate them and talk to them about some of the uses that their products are being put to, and also to let them know what our concerns are as well. We also plan on talking to some of the fentanyl non-scheduled precursor chemical handlers, just to let them know what, as I said, what their products are used for as well. Next slide. And that ends our presentation. I know that Dan and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have, and I thank you for your attention.
Antonio, I think you're muted.
Here I am. Thanks a lot, Dan, and thanks a lot, John. Very interesting presentation, particularly the initiative that the EAA has already taken with the private sector. No doubt that without the help, the active involvement of the private sector, this work cannot be fought. And at the very end, I think that the private sector, as we will see later on, has an interest in joining and in playing a very active part in this fight. I give now the floor to my colleague Marchetta in order to present us the state of art of precursor control, at least from the perspective of the international or the Secretariat of the International Narcotic Control Board. Marchetta is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you are. First of all, I would like to request the organizers if they could please upload my presentation. As Antonio said, my name is Marketa Jačková. I work as Drug Control Officer in the Precursors Control section of the Secretariat of the International Narcotics Control Board. It is my honor to be here today at this important event and to see so many people in this webinar. My presentation is focused mainly on the INCB's tools and programs to counter precursor diversion. As you know, there are many INCB tools and programs, but in view of time and also considering the topic of this event, I will mainly focus on the ones that relate to cooperation with industry. Next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, let me briefly share a few words about the International Narcotics Control Board and explain its roles in the international precursors control system. INCB is an independent UN body that ensures that adequate supplies of drugs and chemicals are available for legitimate uses and that the diversion for illegitimate purposes doesn't occur. INCB consists of 13 members that are elected by ECOSOC, and they serve in their personal capacity and not as government representatives, and its secretariat is based in Vienna, Austria. As you all know, the International Precursors Control System is grounded in Article 12 of the 1988 Convention, and under the treaty, INCB has a responsibility to monitor and promote measures taken by governments to prevent diversion of substances that are frequently used in the illicit drug manufacture. That's the bubble on the top. These measures include the monitoring of the international legitimate trade, which is done on real-time basis through PEN online system. The system ensures that authorities of importing country are informed of planned shipments of precursors that are destined for that country. The notification gives authorities of the importing country a possibility to check and ensure the legitimacy of each transaction, the company or companies involved, and the intended uses of the substance. In this context, it's very important to know what the normal patterns of illicit trade are to be able to identify any unusual patterns or any suspicious in the illicit trade. If a suspicious transaction or attempted diversion in legitimate trade is identified, it should of course be investigated. In this context, INCB provides support for investigations into suspicious stop shipments and objected shipments. It provides also infrastructure for global focal point network and time-bound operations under the two projects. It's Project PRISM, which is focusing on the amphetamine type stimulant precursors, and Project Cohesion, focusing on cocaine and heroin precursors. INCB also provides platforms and forums for intelligence sharing. The platform that is used for sharing incidents in real time is called the Precursors Incident Communication System, or simply PICS. That's the one you see at the bottom of the slide. If you imagine a coin, the PEN online system, the illicit trade, would be on one side of it, and on the other side of the coin, you would have the PICS, the illicit side, the seizures. And both sides are equally important to have the complete picture of the situation. In fact, we have just launched PICS2, which is an upgraded version of the PICS, so I would like to encourage you to have a look at it and use it to the maximum, to its maximum potential. Another responsibility that I would like to mention of the board under Article 12 includes assessing chemicals for international control. That's the bubble on the left, and then on the screen there are some examples of the scheduling decision as taken by CND. Next slide, please. Thank you. Currently, there are 30 substances that are controlled internationally. You see all of them on the slide. As you know, the situation related to the use of substances in the illicit drug manufacture is not static. As John has already mentioned, when a substance is put under international control, traffickers will start using another substance or substances to circumvent the controls. On the slide, you also see the substances that have been added since 2014. There are 7 in total. 3 are precursors of amphetamines, 2 are precursors of fentanyl, and 2 are precursors of MDMA, ecstasy. Out of those, 5 are designer precursors, which means, as it has already been mentioned, that they were actually created solely for the purpose of circumventing controls. MAPA was the last substance that was added to Table 1 and is also one of the 5 designer precursors that were put under international control. And as soon as this substance was put under international control, almost immediately, a new substance called EAPA has been reported, which is actually ethyl ester of MAPA. So I would like also to mention that 6 of the substances have been added within the period of 3 years, which really indicates the rapid pace at which those substances emerge. The issue is that the number of non-scheduled chemicals that could potentially be used to replace the traditional precursors is almost infinite. So how can this issue be addressed? Well, the legislative exchanges provide long-term solutions. We all know that. However, in the context of their enforcement and administration, they may often be resource intensive, and in most cases, long periods of time are required for their introduction, so that there are some limitations in terms of being able to ensure the timely and adequate prevention of diversion of precursors. This is where actually the concept or the cooperation with industry comes in. Next slide, please. The cooperation with industry has come to play an increasingly significant role in global precursors control, and is one of the top themes or topics that have been widely recognized and emphasized in recent years as critical to precursor control, as mentioned already by the previous speakers. Why? Because it is effective and sustainable way to address some of the challenges, including the non-scheduled chemicals, designer precursors, diversion from domestic distribution channels, as well as the misuse of equipment, which I would also like to mention later on. The concept as such is not new. In fact, it is an integral part of the 1988 convention. However, in addition to the mandatory provisions contained in the convention, many governments have explored supplementing and extending the efficiencies of existing precursor controls through strategies based on the voluntary involvement of industry in regulating the production and distribution of these substances. As we all know, these strategies are based on shared goals and responsibility, and often formalized through voluntary agreements, including MOUs, voluntary codes, or other forms of agreements. We can actually say that industry is a partner at intersection of illicit trade and trafficking. It is really the first line of defense. In the context of their business, the industry knows its products, the usual client, which goes back to the know your client or customer principle. They have a good sense of what is normal, so they can identify suspicious inquiries and orders as well. So the identification of suspicious inquiries and orders is one element, but on the other element is to share that information with the authorities, which will enable to alert other companies in the same country, as traffickers may approach them with the similar requests or orders. And then also sharing such information on the international level with all competent national authorities through INCB helps to prevent traffickers from obtaining the respective chemicals elsewhere. In a number of countries, this mechanism of notifying the suspicious orders and inquiries is also extended to non-scheduled substances, including those of the international concern that are listed on the International Special Surveillance List, which is a tool that I will also mention in my presentation. Another important thing I would like to mention is that most of the commercial transactions involving precursor chemicals are legitimate and conducted by bona fide companies as part of their daily business activity. So any additional legislative controls would potentially or could potentially place an unnecessary administrative burden on the private sector, but also on the public sector. One of the advantages of the cooperating with the industry is really the speed of response and flexibility, which are key in addressing the current challenges that I have already mentioned, and as they have been mentioned already also by the previous speakers. Countries where this concept has been implemented have demonstrated that it is possible to balance a favorable commercial environment for chemical trade with effective precursor control. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what does INCB do to assist governments in their efforts to establish, implement, or enhance the concept? INCB continues to raise awareness about the importance and potential of this concept. In 2015, there was an entire thematic chapter dedicated to this theme in the INCB report. It has also been among the main topics discussed in several events, including conferences, workshops, and other events. The concept has also been mentioned in a number of INCB recommendations, C&D resolutions, and conference paper, which really confirms its importance and potential in the current precursor control. Since 2016, INCB has also encouraged the so-called twinning between governments. The twinning is carried out by countries in which the cooperation with industry is well established to assist those governments that are in the process of establishing or are interested to establish and implement such cooperation. There is a very recent example that has demonstrated that twinning can be a practical and useful tool. The example involves the United Republic of Tanzania, where an MOU between the public and private sector was signed. And I think you will hear more about this from our next speaker. And in this case, a guidance was provided through the cooperation, through close cooperation with France and Switzerland. In addition to the twinning, INCB has also made available a number of resources and tools which provide practical guidance and examples in these areas. Those include the guidelines. We have also practical notes, which include the model memorandum of understanding, which can and should be adjusted to the respective country's needs. And there is also awareness raising brochure related to public-private partnerships. I have included in my presentation last slide with all the links so that you know exactly where to and how to access those publications, tools, and materials. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another tool is the International Special Surveillance List. This list includes substances that are not under international control, but are frequently used in the illicit manufacture of drugs. Currently, there are 56 chemicals that are listed individually, but it also includes extended definitions that were added in 2013. The extended definitions capture common derivatives and other related substances that can be converted into one of the scheduled precursors. Just to give you an example, the new substance that I have mentioned earlier called EAPA is not listed individually, but it is covered by the extended definitions. What I would also like to mention is that in 2019, the ISSL was further amended to highlight chemicals for which INCB is unaware of any known legitimate uses. Apart from the substances and the extended definitions, the list also includes recommended actions for both the competent authorities and the industry. The actions envisage system of informal, voluntary, but active cooperation between the authorities and the industry, whereby, as I have mentioned before, the industry should notify the authorities of suspicious inquiries and orders involving substances on the list. And of course, it's a two-way mechanism. So the authorities should also provide a feedback to the industry on trafficking and clandestine drug manufacturing activities, seizures, and so on. It is also important to sensitize and raise awareness and understanding regarding the use of non-scheduled substances. There are many more elements in the ISSL which is available to all competent national authorities, either as a standalone document on our secure website or as part of the information package. Next slide, please. Thank you. Illicit drug manufacture not only requires precursor chemicals, it also requires equipment such as specialized glassware, tableting machines, and other hardware employed in the so-called cooking process. In this context, it is Article 13 that actually calls governments to take appropriate measures to prevent trade-in and the diversion of materials and equipment for illicit drug manufacture and to cooperate to this end. Here, I would like to say that like precursors, which have valid industrial, chemical, and pharmaceutical applications, but are also used in the illicit manufacture of drugs, equipment has also regular applications in the pharmaceutical, chemical, and related industries, but is also sought by traffickers for use in the illicit manufacture of drugs. So similarly to precursors, the challenges for governments is to have measures in place to prevent the diversion of this type of equipment while ensuring its availability for legitimate purposes. So to assist governments in this area, INCB has in 2020 issued guidelines related to equipment. The guidelines provide various options, measures, and approaches. And it is not a surprise that one of the measure or approach include voluntary initiatives conducted in cooperation with industry. Well, the cooperation with industry has been proven to be successful with regard to substances included in Table 1 and Table 2 of the 1988 Convention, as well as for non-scheduled substances. So the same principle, including the know your client or customer principle, could be applied to equipment as well for identifying and reporting suspicious orders and transactions. Also, the existing INCB resources and tools that I have mentioned earlier could be used for equipment as well. So here I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that the concept of cooperation with industry could be applicable to controlled and non-controlled chemicals and equipment and plays a pivotal role in addressing the current challenges in precursors control. On the next slide, you have just the list of the useful resources, as I have mentioned earlier. And that brings us, the next slide brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Antonio.
Yes. Thank you to you, Marketa. Yes, in the Secretariat of the International Narcotic Control Board, we are trying to make all these tools available to everybody. Marketa mentioned some of our platforms that are particularly important in order to make all your work as proactive as possible. And I refer in particularly to PIC. PIC that is the platform where incidents are reported, sharing information about new substances, new precursors that are entering the market is absolutely indispensable, as well as making sure that illicit trade can continue. At the very end, nobody wants to have a long list of chemical substances that are forbidden. What we want is to stop those substances that facilitate the work of traffickers. And in order to do so, is fundamental the role of the public, of the private sector, within a framework established with national authority. And this is the experience of Tanzania. And I'm happy to give the floor to Ms. Berta Mumuya from the Drug Control and Enforcement Authority of the United Republic of Tanzania. Berta, the floor is yours.
Bertha, it looks like you are still muted if you're able to unmute yourself for your presentation.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
Berta, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone. If you can put on the slide, please, so that I can introduce myself. This slide. First slide, please. My name is Bertha Mumuya, a Commissioner for Forensic Drug Control and Enforcement Authority in Tanzania, with responsibility of identifying seized material and preventing diversion of precursors, chemicals, and psychotropic substances. Second slide, please. Next one. Yeah, that's a map of Tanzania showing us that we, on the eastern side, is an Indian Ocean. You can see the Zanzibar, Mountain Kilimanjaro, and other things that you can see on the page. We are surrounded by 8 landlocked countries, 7 landlocked. Mozambique on the southern side, Malawi, and then we have Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and Zambia on the west, and Kenya and Uganda on the north. We have the Serengeti, Ngorongoro, and all that are touristic places in Tanzania. You invited all of you. Next slide, please. To start with the introduction, I would like to, the demand of use of precursor chemical in Tanzania for legitimate activity has been increasing, I would say from year 2000. And then the government in 2003 decided to put on a law, an Act of Industrial and Consumer Chemical Act was annexed on its Schedule 7, giving restriction for precursor chemicals to be controlled. This increased legitimate activity, such as these are scientific, teaching, research, textile industry, painting, plastic industry, pharmaceutical industry, and mining industry. These have been using huge volumes of precursor chemical, and with that use of a lot of precursor, a parallel illicit market evolved, and hence the control mechanism to prevent diversion needed to be strengthened. The national strategies to prevent the diversion of chemicals. Next slide, please. We are on the next slide. Okay, yeah, we are. I'll say the strategy, the national initiative has 2 major components. One was, no, the one before that one, please. The one before that, please. The previous slide, yes. I said the first was strengthening national legislation framework and in controlling precursor chemicals, and this is mandatory. Out of that, we have 3 legislations that control precursor chemicals in the country. So the first one, the Drug Control and Enforcement Act, so number 5 of 2008, was enacted and established this DCEA with the mandate to prevent drug trafficking, including prevention of diversion of precursor chemicals to illicit use. The two other acts is Industrial and Consumer Chemical Management Act, Cap number 82, and the Tanzania Food, Drug and Cosmetic Cap 219. These ones had to be reviewed in order to increase the enforcement of controlling precursors, like increasing. We had to use import and export permits, monthly returns to the registrar on the stock of precursor that you have that we have used. Those are some of the things that were reviewed in the 2 acts. Next slide. Oh. Slide number 5, please. I'll say the second, was the implementation of public-private partnership, which is voluntary. This one, just a book. Yeah, the reason why we thought of this is the adoption of the CND Resolution 62. 1, the meeting outcome of the 3rd International Conference, Precursor Chemicals and New Psychoactive Substance, held in Bangkok in 2017 recognized that, among other things, the important role of the private sector in preventing diversion from illicit manufacture and trade of such substances. Tanzania is a signatory to the three conventions, the 1961, 1971, and the 1888. So in the case of Tanzania, I would say, in Tanzania, incidents of trafficking precursors in the year 2015 to 2017 increased, and there was a trend of producers in the East Asia to send precursor chemicals to Tanzania and then back to East Asia, where these were a number of reported cases. One of the outstanding incidents, I would say, it's a consignment of 21.7 metric tons of acetic anhydride, which was seized in Pakistan in 2016, trafficked from Tanzania. This raised a lot of issues in the country, and hence there was a need for implementation of further controlling and strengthening the existing control. The next slide, please. Then I'll come straight to the implementation of public-private partnership in Tanzania. In October 2017, Tanzania was introduced by NCB to the project titled Development of and Implementation of Public-Private Partnership and their role in preventing the diversion of precursor chemicals. The project went concurrently with training and provision of guidance material and training to partners in Switzerland, that's from Swiss Medics, and in the French organization, MNCPC. We had two training. One was in Bern and another one was in Vienna. And then the first one was in 2017 and the second one was 2018. Thereafter, in 2018, DCA had to identify all stakeholders, including the key public sector involved in regulating, controlling, and clearance of precursor chemical at points of entry. These are the competent national authority, including the Registrar of Chemical, Registrar of Pharmaceuticals, Customs, Police, and ourselves. Later in 2018, DCA coordinated an initial meeting with all identified competent national authorities to address the concept. After good discussion, gaps were identified on implementing the existing legislation. Hence, way forward to improvement was suggested. It is through this meeting the project implementation committee or secretariat was established. Its member including individual from competent national authority. Next, okay. In 2018, DCA coordinated and convened two inception workshops. One meeting involved chemical stakeholders, and the second was and the second was for pharmaceutical association. The workshop aimed at introducing the voluntary concept of PPP to the private sector and discuss the way forward. Implementation Secretariat came up with a zero draft document which was customized to suit Tanzanian environment, meaning considering the acts that were existing, regulation, procedures, guidelines. Yeah, those are the things that were part of the improvement of the zero draft, which was first drafted by this Secretariat. In 2019, DCA, in collaboration with National Competent Authority, held a series of meetings, workshops, and with private sector to discuss and develop the MOU and the Code of Conduct or Code of Practice documents. The documents were later circulated to all stakeholders for further improvements and further inputs. Next slide, please. After all this initiative, progress was achieved. In end of August 2021, the Drug Control and Enforcement Authority, DCA, on behalf of the competent national authority and the government of Tanzania, finalized the partnership by signing an MOU with private sector to prevent the diversion of precursor chemicals. The signing event involved 27 individual companies, 2 associations, that is the Tanzania Association for Pharmaceutical Industry, TAPI, and which represents 125 importers and distributors, and the Tanzania Pharmaceutical and Manufacturer Association, TPMA, representing 9 pharmaceutical manufacturer industry. Should be noted that this is just a step into the right direction, as we still have to convince more companies to sign in the memorandum of understanding. I would say we have more than 1,700 stakeholders in the chemical sectors. These are importers and distributors. So we still have a lot to do with that. I would say the concept of, in the region, I would say the concept of PPP is in preventing the diversion of precursor chemical was emphasized to other countries in the region. Workshop held in Dar es Salaam, the regional workshop held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in October 2019. The workshop was organized by INCB and coordinated by DCA, whereby participants from a number of countries, Burundi, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Malawi, Rwanda, Zambia, attended the workshop. Among the liberation of the workshop it was recommended that the United Republic of Tanzania play a leading role in further promoting the voluntary concept in the region. I'm saying, despite of the milestone achieved, the progress was not that smooth. Next slide, please. Next, on challenges, yes, thank you. I said, despite of the milestone achieved, the progress was not that smooth due to a number of reasons, such as lack of association for more than 1,700 stakeholders in chemical sector. However, this was not the case for pharmaceutical, which had already had 2 well-established and organized associations. So it was easy to deal with the pharmaceutical side more than the other chemical side. A second challenge was some members of the private sector thought by signing the document, that is the MOU and code of practice, it's no longer voluntary, and it may have consequences in the future. So it was difficult we had to convince them to sign. That's why you see we still have only 27 companies signing, while we have more than 1,000 and something on the chemical sector. Also, the culture of voluntary compliance is not common. People like to do the mandatory thing, not voluntary. So that's another thing. And another challenge was issues of confidentiality were raised by wanting to know how and if they will be protected after sharing sensitive information. That's another. And another one was the approach is not common to enforcement agencies. Enforcement agents normally want to see someone has broken the law, they take action on it, and not have a discussion, a two-way discussion to smoothen things. That's all. I would say, and the last one was the COVID-19 pandemic slowed down the pace of awareness raising and voluntary concept to more stakeholders. So we couldn't reach a lot of people because of the COVID. We couldn't attend meetings, and we couldn't call people. We were not supposed to meet in large groups. So that was those are the challenges which we faced. I'll say on the way forward, next slide, please. To review and make use of the developed voluntary code of practice after signing, which we think in the next few months we'll be signing it, and to encourage chemical sectors in the partnership to chemical sector into partnership and to establish their own association and involve more number of stakeholders in partnership through awareness. Another way for this to strengthen information sharing mechanism among public partnership and public-private partnership, which including sharing of information through leaflets, through websites, emails, toll-free number, anonymous call when they're giving information of any suspicious activity. And the last one was to strengthen cooperation at national, regional, and international level in preventing the diversion of precursor chemical and sharing of every novel approach to achieve the subject matter. For example, by visiting existing tools with the INCB, it was mentioned earlier, the PEN, the PEAK, Ionic, Cohesion, and PRISM. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Berta, and I'm sure that the experience as well as the way forward, the recommendation made by the Tanzanian experience will be of great help to everybody. And we are already ahead of our schedule. I pass immediately the floor to my colleague from UNODC and the lab section. Please, Asma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And I have to apologize in advance for my voice. I am losing it, but I hope everyone can hear me fine. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Asma Fakhri. I am the Program Management Officer at the UNODC Lab and Scientific Service. I'm also the coordinator of the UNODC Opioid Strategy, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague Connor Crean, Scientific Affairs Officer at the Lab and Scientific Service. Before anything, and I'm very conscious of time, I just wanted to say thank you very much to INL for inviting us to be part of this extremely important panel and discussion today. And it's always an honor to be speaking on a panel that is kicked off or started by the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of INL, Mr. Jim Walsh. Now, we're going to look to bring a little bit of a different angle to today's discussion, and an angle that is equally important, if not essential. And that is how important it is to plan for disposal of precursor chemicals that are seized at the get-go of any kind of precursor control efforts. And this, as I'm sure a lot of you can appreciate, is a really important plan of any drug control efforts, but particularly when we're speaking about precursor chemicals or dangerous substances. And so this importance is echoed in the UNODC opioid strategy, and equally so in the soon to be released synthetic drug strategy. And now industry engagement, of course, is one of the key themes of this panel, and it's a critical part as industry represents one of the first stages of, or options, let's say, for disposal. If you cannot hear me, please let me know. I'll get closer to the mic. So as we said, industry engagement is critical as one of the first steps of any kind of disposal plans. And with the support of INL, the UNODC Lab and Scientific Service is building capacity in several countries around Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Southeast Asia Pacific, on the technical aspects, as well as on the development of national disposal plans. As I'm sure we can all appreciate, how dangerous such disposal exercises could be if they are not guided by accurate scientific approaches, or guided by science in the first place. And we're so if
Hello? Hello? Asma? Are you there? We lost you. Connor, I don't know if you can take over, because I have the impression that she lost connection. Maybe you
Please, yeah, thank you, Antonio. Maybe I'll just share my screen. So following on from what Asma was mentioning, I'll talk to you a little bit about the tools and services that we have within the laboratory and scientific service, specifically in the area of precursor chemicals. Initially, maybe the role of the work that we do in the laboratory and scientific service is to improve the national forensic capacity and capabilities of member states to meet internationally accepted standards and ensure that these standards are available and accessible worldwide. Specifically in the area of precursor chemicals, the first clients that we work with are the law enforcement or first responding officers. So within the laboratory in Vienna, we produce drug and precursor testing kits. So these are simple color test based kits that we provide maybe 500 to 1,000 of these each year. And these are used in the field. So what we do in conjunction with this is we provide training. So we travel around the world and we deliver training to law enforcement officers on the correct use and actual limitations of these kits and what they can be used for and what they can't be used for. In an ideal world, we bring people to the laboratory in Vienna. We do this to work in a controlled environment where we can teach the law enforcement and the forensic personnel how to use drug and precursor testing kits, modern handheld devices, and for other forensic personnel who actually work in the laboratory, we also work directly with them and do training. We know that training has been a difficult thing for everybody to do in the last number of years. So what we've developed in the laboratory is the ability to do this virtually. So we've been able to train several hundred officers in the last year on the use of handheld devices in a remote environment. So it's not an ideal solution. Training needs to be carried out in person, but this is how we've adapted the work that we do to be able to make sure that law enforcement are doing their work correctly. One of the main tools that we have within laboratory and scientific service are the manuals and guidelines that we produce for laboratories. So we have over 40 manuals in this series, and they cover many different areas of forensics, from crime scene investigation to security document examination to identification of drugs, and also specifically for precursor related activities. I'll just go through some of these now briefly to show you the scope of what these tools contain. The first of these is the multilingual dictionary of precursor chemicals frequently used in illicit manufacture of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances under international control. So this is something that contains all of the chemicals that can be used or that are under international control. And it has a lot of different type of information that's useful for member states, and it's produced in the 6 official UN languages. Moving on from this to more for the practitioners who are working on the investigation of clandestine manufacture, we have maybe a very comprehensive 400-page manual that provides information for those investigating the sites of manufacture of drugs. What might they encounter? So this guideline or this manual contains a range of different resources to, for example, show you that if somebody was manufacturing fentanyl, what kind of precursor chemicals and raw materials would be used in the manufacture of fentanyl. We also have a very useful cross-reference table. So if you look at a specific substance that could be manufactured, all of the different precursor chemicals that could be used for that manufacture. So if a certain chemical is used, then this might guide law enforcement officers to be able to get more accurate information on the substances that might be attempted to be manufactured. This also has a quite comprehensive list for the chemists to show them all of the methods that can be used for the manufacture of drugs and what the sources are that these come from for the literature, all the precursor chemicals, all the reaction conditions. So this is a very useful tool for investigation of clandestine manufacture. We have a number of manuals in the area of safe handling and disposal. I think that, as I mentioned, this is an area that we're working in more in the last number of years. We have guidelines for the safe handling and disposal of chemicals used in the illicit manufacture of drugs. And this is to guide people with options that they could look at to dispose of chemicals and how to make the correct decision based on the chemicals that have been identified about what disposal options might be best taken. Many of the sites of manufacture of synthetic drugs is within remote locations. So we have an illustrated guide for the disposal of chemicals used in illicit manufacture of drugs, and this provides information and tools on how to carry out disposal in remote environments. In addition, we've more recently produced a manual on guidelines for the safe handling of synthetic opioids for law enforcement and customs officers. And this tool is, we know, very important in the work that everybody's been doing in the last number of years to ensure that everybody carries out their work safely. So these guidelines cover the potential risks that officers might be exposed to, the types of control measures that they could put in place in order to make sure that they can do their work correctly, as well as very illustrative guide on how to use personal protective equipment to carry out the work that they do. In parallel with this, we have developed personal protective equipment kits based on the contents of these guidelines, and we have been developing and delivering training on this. We've just come back from delivering training in West Africa as well as in Colombia. So this, we think, is a very valuable resource, and I think we're going to be doing more and more training on this in the coming months, in the coming year. Just to maybe give you an idea of the scope of the clients that we work with through the main technical assistance program we have within the laboratory and scientific service. We run a proficiency test with forensic laboratories, and we work with over 300 laboratories in 90 countries around the world. And through this direct connection, we talk to the labs all the time. We find out what their challenges are, and we adjust the work that we do to meet their needs. So it's a continuing evolution of the work of the laboratory, but this connection with the lab is the key for us to get the scientific information that is necessary from what challenges they're facing in different parts of the world, and how we need to tailor the work that we do to excuse me, to meet the needs in different parts of the world. Yeah, with that, I'd just like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Asma, do you want to take the floor again?
Thank you very much, Antonio. I'm not sure what was the last thing that was sounded, but I think I was at the point of just introducing my colleague, Connor Crean, who's the lead scientific affairs officer, and you've just heard from him. Thank you. We actually wanted to end the presentation with a video on disposal, a 1-minute video on disposal that I believe the colleagues at INL will pull up now on the screen. The video usually has sound, but we'll be sharing the link to the video with you as part of the links at the end of the seminar so that you can also see it on your own.
Let me try playing it one more time and tell me if it has sound.
Thank you so much, Jenna. No.
Oh.
And so this is just a quick video, as we were saying, to illustrate not only the importance of doing scientifically informed disposal, particularly of chemicals such as precursor chemicals, but also it highlights the dangers of not doing disposal in the first place. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I'm conscious of the time, and I believe if there are any questions, they will come at the end of the session. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Antonio, and I hope that my initial intervention has been mostly heard.
Yes, no, your intervention was heard. We are really, really late. Yes, we have also already a few questions. Please drop your question in the question and answer box. But I give immediately the floor to Philip in representation of the European Chemical Industry Council. It's very important, your intervention, Philip. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to get the right screen. Sorry for that. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you see my slides? So my name is Philip de Smet. Welcome everyone from Brussels. I'm working for Cefic. I'm also the sector group manager for BDO and derivatives. So GBL being one of these components on the list, one in the US. That's why I'm familiar with the topic. Cefic is basically the voice of the chemical industry in Europe. For those that do not know Cefic, it represents large, medium, and small chemical companies in Europe. And we serve the members of, let me try to see, yeah. We serve the members of the European chemical industry by generating and aggregating scientific knowledge that we offer needs-oriented services and expertise to our members, and we engage and represent and advocate in a focused way to create the right support and policy frameworks for the chemical industry. And we try to add value by acting collectively rather than to individual company activities. Yeah, it has been mentioned before. It starts with the UN Convention of 1998, which already recognized that it's a collective responsibility of all states and that coordinated action is required to eradicate illicit traffic. In Europe, this has been implemented in the drug precursor regulation. I give you the references, you can look it up afterwards. So there is a European regulation of 2004 for within the EU and with outside. We also have listed chemicals and non-listed chemicals, and the non-listed chemicals, the focus is on cooperation. That cooperation is also explained in Article 9 and 10 of those legislations. So we are basically talking about chemicals that are legitimate products, but can also be used as a drug precursor. So we have the ones that are basically listed, that have an important economic weight. They're controlled to prevent the diversion of these components for the use of to make drugs. But on the other hand, especially for the non-controlled ones, we don't want to handicap the production, the use, and the legitimate trade. So we need to prevent that these things that are used to make legitimate products are then illicitly diverted. So the concept is one of cooperation. It's a cornerstone of our approach. We want to create a partnership with competent authorities, and that needs a good understanding of the respective difficulties on both sides. We as a chemical industry in this cooperation would expect that there is a certain aspect of confidentiality when we got like suspicious order and we communicate to authorities. There's some confidentiality to be guaranteed. We also want feedback when we notice like suspicious cases. We have some doubts on the reliability of the customer. We pass it on to authorities. We'd like to have some fast feedback. And what we need is a single point of contact. Now, one of the programs that the chemical industry and what is the responsibility we want to take up. We want to have a responsible use of our products. So the chemical industry has set up a program called Responsible Care, which proactively supports safe chemical management Our idea is to safeguard people and the environment by continuously improving environmental health and safety standards, facilitate security and the safety of our products. We want to strengthen chemical management systems around the world. We want to work with business partners so to promote that our chemicals are managed in a safe way. And we want to engage with stakeholders to respond to their concerns and communicate openly on our performance in our products. And we want to contribute to sustainability through the development of innovative technologies. This is promoted by more than 60 chemical associations around the world. Even China is participating in the CPCIF, and there's more than 500 companies that have already signed, where the CEO has signed that they adhere to this program. It is basically a continuing story. It started in '98. It has been laid out, and then you see that there is ISO norms being developed, implementing of HSE standards. There is a responsible care revirgination project that is started. There is the sustainable development goals that we support. And here you see a map of the countries that are adhering to this responsible care, where the National Chemical Association is sort of highlighting this program. Now, I'm going to focus in on two substances, BDO and GBL. In Europe, they're on the voluntary list. In the US, GBL is on the list 1. But I will show you what we as an association have been doing. We have developed a voluntary product stewardship for BDO GBL. We have that's now supported by, it started as a CITFIC initiative. It's now supported by the International Council of Chemical Associations. That's basically for the whole chemical industry in the world. And what are the main elements for this program for focusing specifically on BDO and GBL? It's that companies implement procedures to sort of follow the trace of where these products go. When they got an order, they check whether the customer is credible. They collect end-use declarations. What are you going to use it? We request distributors that they apply the same procedures. We notify to authorities suspicious orders. We use containers so that you cannot tamper them and remove some of it. We apply exactly the same procedures for a sample. When someone wants, I want a liter of this stuff to do some testing, we will follow the same procedure. And we monitor and review these procedures on a regular basis. And you will see that this thing can be found on the ICCA website. This thing started in 2005, was revised in 2009, in 2014, in 2019. We organized a workshop for distributors. We got a commitment from ICCA in 2016. Then we did a roadshow in China and Taiwan at associations and a conference for the chemical industry in 2017-18. We did a presentation at the Interpol headquarters at another conference, RRSC. And finally, what we intend to do is our members have all now signed this, that they are adhering to this voluntary product stewardship code, and it will be published on the ICCA website. And we're inviting other companies that are producing these products to join this initiative. So this is my last slide. What are the cornerstones? There's 3 things. So when you get an order, you first investigate whether your customer is credible. You try to evaluate, does anyone know this customer? You use your regular business contacts, and there's a lot of things that we basically have a sort of list of things to check how credible a customer is. Then the customer has to fill in an end-use declaration. What are you going to use it for? That's actually evaluated. And then we have a number of criteria to identify a suspicious transaction. So, transaction. So, if you have a customer who lacks business sense, or he doesn't want to give a telephone number or an address, or the order is placed at an irregular, illogical interval, and the quantities don't look credible, or the modes of payments are not what is standard, or the goods are ordered in small containers, or there is a discrepancy between what you order and what you want to use it for. So these are the things we're doing. This is where a good voluntary measure to prevent the diversion of these products, what we do. So I thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks a lot, Philip, also for being very, very synthetic. And I have 3 questions. We will try to answer. I pass the first one to Marketa. What is the minimum control set for materials and equipment as per Article 13 of the 88 Convention? Marketa.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you for this question. What is the minimum control set for materials and equipment as for Article 13 of the 1988 Convention? If you look at the article, it's actually one single paragraph. And it's, as I said in my presentation, it calls on parties to take measures to prevent trade in and the diversion of materials and equipment. What we as INCB are looking at is at the compilation of options of what governments could do in this regard to address this issue. We're also aware that number of governments have already taken steps. Some of them has certain pieces of legislation under national controls, which also brings me to mention the INCB website on materials and equipment, which includes the repository of national approaches with relation to the equipment. But as I said, you may have noticed, we have circulated a document in August, which includes a set of options, measures, and approaches that governments could consider in addressing this issue and in increasing the operational use of this article. And again, it's not a surprise that the voluntary cooperation with industry is one of them listed in the document. So again, it is a very important element in this aspect. Thank you very much. Over to you, Antonio. And also perhaps what I would like to mention is that in 2020, the guidelines that I have mentioned, they have also much more details on the measures. But again, we are currently looking into this area. But the convention as such, there is one article. Also, a bit of details are provided in the commentary. But with this awareness raising paper, we hope to be able to provide to all governments the set of available options and measures that they could consider implementing. Thank you. I hope I have answered your question. Over to you, Antonio.
Yes, thank you, Marketa. And yes, at the level of the INCB Secretariat, we are working a lot in order to make Article 13 and the options of an opportunity provided by Article 13 much more available to governments, but also to the private sector. And talking about the private sector, Philip, I think there are 2 questions for you. The first one is what is the most important factor to communicate with stakeholders regarding awareness of public-private partnership? I think that in part this question has been answered. Voluntary cooperation, confidentiality. You mentioned the need for one single point of entry, and also the feedback, because who cooperates even if it's just a sharing of information, wants to have feedback. And the other question is, in Ecuador, over 1,700 chemical companies have already subscribed a code of conduct. You mentioned what in Europe has been done. I'm sure that there are other regional or national association of producers. How difficult would be to pass the ball of the initiative to the private sector? I think that the private sector has a very strong interest in not getting entangled with drug traffickers. So what do you think? How difficult would be to create a network of private associations?
Yeah, I would say the responsible care, as you've seen, has been deployed in many countries, and we're still trying to convince more countries to join. And we're very active in capacity building and transferring this know-how. Now, if you the way responsible care works is that it is promoted by the National Chemical Association. It has to sort of make events whereby companies that are in that country are sort of invited to join the program, and then they have to learn what it means. But as you say, selling to drug traffickers is probably not an act of responsible care. So it is for that. I think what I try to show with the BDO GBL is a specific one, because GBL, you don't need massive amounts to misuse it as a drug. It was already by the United Nations Committee on Narcotics drug put on a list. So there you basically need to convince companies, well, don't sell to anyone. We see companies selling on the internet, clearly knowing very well what they're doing, and not selling clearly for the legitimate use of GBL, but the quantities they're selling suggest that they know that it can also be misused. So, but it's really, I think the responsible care is a good initiative if you've that in your country, and work with these chemical associations. They can sort of decline what and invite people to look at their procedures and help them. And for the BDO GBL, we've actually done guidelines on what it means. I showed like we have 9 principles, but behind each principle, there's a lot of things that are behind it, and we can educate. I hope that answered more or less your question.
Yes, it does. I think thanks a lot. And let me thank everybody for their participation. We got other 2 questions, but we will make sure that a written answer will be provided to those questions. I think that this initial session was extremely rich in terms of substance. There is a lot that is going on, a lot that make us hoping that from a reactive stance, we will all move towards a much more proactive one, together with the private sector. The role of the private sector will be indeed extremely important, I would say crucial, in making sure that the response that is given is not an obstacle to trade, but on the opposite, make trade and the work of the private sector even easier. This is in order to play a positive sum game where everybody has his own interest coming ahead. Thanks a lot to everybody. Over 850 participants throughout this session. Thanks a lot, Jenna. And with this, I give the floor to you. Goodbye. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Antonio. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to our panelists for their time this morning. I hope everybody got a lot out of this session. As a reminder, this is the first of 5 sessions this week, all looking at different aspects of the drug crisis and how the private sector can assist. So feel free to join us for the remaining sessions this week. I put the link to register for the other sessions into the chat box. I'll paste it again now. And we hope to see you all later. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. Goodbye.